Good morning. Welcome to the class, The Theory and Practice of Literary Criticism. I'm Boreas Sachs. I'll be your guide, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you very much for registering. As you might know, I've taught lots of different classes in the Mercy College Graduate Literature Program, but I've never taught this one before, so it will be an adventure and a learning experience for me as well. Now, as you might also know, I've written quite a few books, most of them about animals in literature and the arts and other aspects of human culture. Books like Crow, Lizard, Animals in the Third Reich, Imaginary Animals, The Mythical Zoo, and quite a few others. Now, I'm mentioning that partly because I realize that inevitably I am asking you for a good deal of trust. After all, I know that literature means a lot to you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be enrolled. And many of you are writers, so I'll be looking at your work, making comments, and so I want to say that this really is something I know a little bit about. I've worked with all sorts of literary editors, with translators. My books have been translated into about 9 or 10 languages. I've done some translating myself. I've worked with quite a few agents. So if you have questions about the literary profession, I just might possibly be able to help. Well, now to the subject matter of our course. I think the word criticism can be a little bit misleading because, after all, what we're trying to do is not primarily to criticize, certainly not in the sense of finding fault, but to help people relate to works of literature. We try to put them in some sort of context so that they will make sense in terms of people's lives, so that perhaps we can even extract some sort of wisdom from them that we can apply in our own lives. Now, for this, it is necessary to have some sort of critical theory. You can certainly try to do this on the basis of common sense and shared understandings, but one problem with that is that common sense is very transient. After all, in historical terms, it is not that long ago that the divine right of kings was common sense, but it isn't anymore. Now, in 100 years, or a decade, or even less, who knows what people will regard as common sense. And I think we add to the durability of our writings if we base them on some more systematic ideas. As you also know, criticism is almost as old as literature, but not quite. We will be looking at some very early text, but most of the course will be focused on the last 100 years or so. Criticism has gone through lots of changes. For a while, at least in relation to poetry, criticism went into eclipse. There was a very influential essay, which unfortunately is not in our textbook, by poet Randall Jarrell, entitled The Age of Criticism, where he argued that we had become too critical, that poets felt inhibited to a point where they lacked the boldness to put forth new techniques and original ideas because they were just so afraid of some sort of snarky comments. Well, for several years, in mostly the 1960s, poets tried to write in a way that would not require mediation, that would go directly to the reader without needing interpretation or explication of any sort. But that didn't last long, and in the 1970s, criticism was back with perhaps more intensity than ever before. Critics, postmodernists and others, began to feel that creativity was not simply a prerogative of poets and fiction writers, that in criticism they could be just as creative, and they might even have a more direct relationship to the reader than practitioners of traditional literary genres. They started to write much more impressionistically, and they no longer felt the demand to subordinate their feelings and their impulses and their own creativity to ideals of objectivity. Well, that lasted for a while, but now we are in another era where the parameters of the debate are not yet clear. It's a time when we can't take very much for granted, where the value of either traditional literature or criticism no longer seems by any means self-evident, where we have perhaps greater freedoms than in previous times to experiment with styles and ideas, but where the burden of making sense of the world is perhaps at least as great as ever before. Now, this is the textbook that we'll be using, the Norton Anthology of Criticism and Theory. When I first saw that book, all I could think was, wow, it's this thick, almost 3,000 pages of small print, and I thought, my God, this book has everything. But then I looked a little more closely, and I realized that it didn't. Now, when I was coming of age, Jean-Paul Sartre was not just a literary figure, his name was kind of a buzzword. Everybody knew it. And he was sometimes called the literary dictator, a informal and perhaps not very flattering title that he sometimes shared with T.S. Eliot. Well, he's not in the book at all. I already mentioned Randall Jarrell's influential essay, The Age of Criticism. Well, it's not there either, and neither are a number of figures who, not so long ago, were considered among the foremost critics of our age. People like I.A. Richards and William Empson. Now, I don't fault the editors of that grand anthology at all. That just goes to show what a vast and diverse field theory and criticism has become. Now, there is still a pretty good consensus on who the most influential figures are, people like Foucault and Freud, but beyond that, it's up to you to decide. You will need, as I said, some sort of systematic foundation to write about literature, but the kind you choose is up to you. Well, that's about it for the moment, and I'll see you soon in class. Bye.